That's a commercial vehicle violating community standards. I'm having it towed immediately before it destroys our property values and attracts criminal elements to our family neighborhood. That's what Kenneth Sutherland screamed at me while directing the tow truck driver to hook up my 2018 Ford F-150. His pink dress shirt stretched tight across his bloated gut, black dress pants riding up as he gestured wildly with his clipboard toward my personal pickup truck, parked legally in my own driveway. The smell of his cheap cologne mixed with diesel exhaust, and the metallic clang of tow chains as this suburban dictator stood there absolutely convinced he just eliminated a neighborhood eyesore that threatened his precious community's aesthetic standards. I'm Chief Daniel Rodriguez, and for 26 years I've served this city in law enforcement, working my way up from patrol officer to detective to finally earning the chief's badge in 2019. But standing there in my red and black checkered flannel shirt, watching this entitled coward have my personal vehicle towed from my own property, I felt the calm satisfaction of knowing exactly how this would end. What Kenneth didn't know was that in exactly 14 months, he'd be standing in county court facing criminal charges for systematic false police reporting, theft of personal property, and conspiracy to abuse emergency services while I testified as both victim and the chief law enforcement officer whose department he'd been systematically manipulating for his personal vendettas. And I'd be the one wearing my dress uniform, presenting evidence that would send him to county jail for 18 months while destroying his HOA empire forever. What would you do if some HOA tyrant illegally towed your truck from your own driveway? Where are you watching from? Drop a flag emoji and tell me your state, because this story will show you exactly how to destroy vehicle theft schemes using 26 years of law enforcement experience and the authority to investigate every fraudulent call Kenneth had ever made. My name is Daniel Rodriguez, and 3 years ago I thought moving to Stone Ridge Reserve would provide the perfect family neighborhood where my wife Alina and I could raise our teenage daughter Sophia in a safe community that respected law enforcement and understood the sacrifices police families make to protect public safety. After spending over 2 decades protecting this city from real criminals, drug dealers, and violent offenders who actually threaten public welfare, I was looking forward to quiet evenings working on my classic Mustang while teaching Sophia basic automotive maintenance skills. Stone Ridge Reserve marketed itself as a family-oriented community designed for working professionals who valued security, property maintenance, and the kind of suburban safety that comes from having neighbors who respect law enforcement families. The HOA fees were reasonable at $195 monthly, and the covenants emphasized community cooperation, family values, and maintaining an environment where children could grow up safely surrounded by neighbors who appreciated the sacrifices made by public safety families. For the first 18 months after moving in, Stone Ridge felt like exactly the community Alina and I had envisioned for Sophia's teenage years. Neighbors waved when I came home from shifts. Children played safely in the streets knowing police lived nearby. And the monthly HOA meetings focused on playground improvements, community events, and practical issues like street lighting and neighborhood watch programs that enhanced public safety rather than creating bureaucratic obstacles. My personal F-150 served multiple legitimate purposes beyond transportation. The truck was essential for my weekend projects, helping neighbors with home improvements, hauling supplies for Sophia's school fundraising events, and maintaining the kind of community connections that make neighborhoods safer. Having visible police presence, even off-duty, deterred criminal activity and provided reassurance to families who appreciated knowing law enforcement lived nearby with immediate access to emergency response resources. The trouble started when Kenneth Sutherland moved into the largest house on Heritage Drive in March 2022. At 57, Kenneth had the soft appearance of someone who'd spent decades behind a desk criticizing other people's work, while never contributing anything meaningful to community safety or public welfare. He'd made his money through insurance fraud investigation, spending 20 years finding reasons to deny claims to accident victims while developing the cynical worldview that sees threats in every normal aspect of community life. Kenneth immediately positioned himself as a community standards advocate, attending every HOA meeting with typed complaints about declining property values, inappropriate vehicles, and what he called commercial activities that allegedly threatened the residential character that attracted quality families to exclusive neighborhoods. He had strong opinions about work vehicles, pickup trucks, and what he termed quasi-commercial activities that included anything related to public safety or emergency services. Within 6 months, Kenneth had maneuvered himself onto the HOA board by promising to restore community exclusivity through enhanced enforcement of residential standards that would protect property values from inappropriate commercial influences. His first initiative was revising vehicle restrictions to include limitations on pickup trucks, work vehicles, and what he called quasi-governmental activities that supposedly violated residential zoning requirements. The irony wasn't lost on me that Kenneth's complaints focused on exactly the kind of police presence and community engagement that made neighborhoods safe and desirable places to raise families. As a law enforcement professional, I knew that communities with visible police presence, active law enforcement families, and strong police-community relationships were the safest places to live because criminal activity avoids areas where police officers are known to live and work. Kenneth's harassment began subtly with his morning patrol routine in his white HOA golf cart, photographing my truck and documenting what he called commercial vehicle violations that allegedly threatened residential property values. His clipboard became a constant companion as he appointed himself the neighborhood's vehicle enforcement officer, timing my arrivals and departures while maintaining detailed logs of what he considered inappropriate police-related activities in residential areas. The harassment escalated when Kenneth began filing complaints with the HOA board about my F-150, claiming it violated residential parking restrictions despite being parked on my own property. He documented the truck's toolbox as commercial equipment, described my police radio tests as noise violations, and complained that my emergency response capability constituted commercial activity in residential neighborhoods. Kenneth's strategy became clear when he started researching legal ways to eliminate police presence from the neighborhood through systematic harassment, disguised as community standards enforcement. He consulted with towing companies about problem vehicle removal, contacted attorneys about residential zoning violations, and built relationships with other board members who shared his vision of a police-free suburban environment. The breaking point came during Sophia's 16th birthday party when Kenneth appeared at our property line with his phone and clipboard, photographing the gathering like he was documenting criminal activity. Several of Sophia's friends were admiring my truck when Kenneth began his theatrical performance about inappropriate commercial vehicle display in residential neighborhoods. This commercial equipment doesn't belong in family communities where children should be protected from exposure to law enforcement activities, he announced loud enough for the teenagers to hear, his pink dress shirt showing sweat stains despite the mild weather. That evening, as Sophia asked why the mean man didn't like police officers and whether we were doing something wrong by living in a normal neighborhood, I realized Kenneth had made a fundamental miscalculation about who he was targeting with his anti-police harassment campaign. He'd assumed I was just another suburban homeowner who could be intimidated through bureaucratic pressure and towing threats. What he didn't know was that I was the police chief whose department had the authority to investigate vehicle theft, systematic harassment of law enforcement families, and fraudulent abuse of emergency services designed to target police personnel. Kenneth's final mistake was underestimating his opponent while providing me with evidence of systematic targeting of law enforcement families through criminal harassment, disguised as community standards enforcement. He thought he was eliminating inappropriate vehicles from his precious residential neighborhood. What he'd actually done was declare war on the police chief, who had exactly the right authority to investigate his criminal activities and protect law enforcement families from harassment. The war was about to begin, and Kenneth had no idea that his next attempt to tow my truck would result in his arrest for theft, while demonstrating to the entire community the consequences of targeting police families with criminal harassment schemes. Kenneth's first official assault came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning when I found him standing beside my truck with his clipboard pink dress shirt already showing sweat stains as he photographed my F-150 from multiple angles while speaking into a digital recorder about commercial vehicle violations. The smell of his cologne mixed with morning coffee and the sound of his measuring tape as he documented distances with the intensity of someone gathering evidence for a federal case. "Morning, Chief Rodriguez," he called out with fake friendliness, his voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood where children were waiting for school buses. "Just conducting the quarterly vehicle compliance assessment required by updated HOA commercial vehicle protocols. Your pickup appears to violate several recently implemented residential parking standards." The violation notice he handed me was professionally printed on Stone Ridge Reserve letterhead, complete with county zoning citations and a 10-day deadline for compliance. The document was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation, citing residential parking ordinances, commercial vehicle restrictions, and community aesthetic requirements that supposedly applied to my personal truck despite state law specifically protecting residents' right to park personal vehicles on their own property. Kenneth had done extensive research, consulting with towing companies, zoning attorneys, and municipal code enforcement to create the appearance of legitimate authority while systematically targeting my family through selective interpretation of residential parking rules. The violations ranged from commercial equipment display to inappropriate vehicle modifications, to what he termed quasi-governmental activities that allegedly violated residential zoning requirements. Each violation carried fines ranging from $200 to $800, with daily accumulation until compliance was achieved through either expensive modifications or complete removal of my truck from residential property. The total potential penalties exceeded $6,400, obviously calculated to force either costly compliance or elimination of my vehicle from the neighborhood. What Kenneth didn't realize was that he'd just handed detailed evidence of his systematic harassment campaign to the police chief, who specialized in investigating fraudulent complaint patterns and had 26 years of experience recognizing coordinated harassment operations designed to target law enforcement families. The harassment campaign expanded throughout September as Kenneth recruited other HOA board members to join his systematic documentation of alleged violations. Board Secretary Gerald Morrison began photographing my truck's equipment, claiming authority to assess commercial vehicle compliance. Treasurer Sandra Phillips conducted what she called noise assessments of my radio communications, documenting police calls as violations of residential quiet standards. The coordinated nature of their activities revealed this wasn't random neighbor complaints, but an organized campaign to eliminate law enforcement presence through systematic abuse of residential regulations. They'd established Kenneth as coordinator, created false justifications through selective interpretation of parking rules, and maintained detailed documentation designed to create legal cover for harassment of police families. The escalation continued when Kenneth began filing complaints with city agencies about my truck, demonstrating either remarkable ignorance of law enforcement protection statutes or criminal intent to interfere with police operations. The city zoning department received reports about commercial vehicle violations that allegedly threatened residential property values. The county code enforcement office got complaints about my truck supposedly violating residential parking ordinances that contained specific exemptions for law enforcement personnel. Each complaint triggered investigations that forced me to take time away from police duties to meet with inspectors and defend rights that were clearly established in state law protecting police families from harassment. Kenneth had essentially weaponized the regulatory inspection process, turning municipal agencies into unwitting accomplices in his harassment campaign designed to eliminate police presence from residential neighborhoods. The psychological warfare intensified when Kenneth began organizing community safety meetings to discuss what he called inappropriate police activities that threatened residential character and property values. These gatherings featured PowerPoint presentations about declining property values, residential zoning violations, and community character concerns allegedly caused by police presence in civilian neighborhoods. Kenneth positioned himself as the community protector, fighting to preserve residential character against law enforcement activities that violated the separation between police work and civilian family life. By framing police presence as a threat to their suburban lifestyle, Kenneth transformed ordinary neighbors into willing participants in his anti-police harassment campaign. They began filing their own complaints, demanding removal of police vehicles and equipment, creating the appearance of widespread community concern about law enforcement families living in residential areas. The financial pressure escalated when Kenneth's HOA began assessing what they called commercial vehicle impact fees against my property, claiming these fees were authorized by residential zoning requirements. These fees, totaling $3,800, were allegedly required to fund additional security measures necessitated by law enforcement activities that supposedly reduced neighborhood desirability. The breaking point came when Kenneth coordinated with AAA Towing to have my truck removed from my own driveway at 2:03 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. I was awakened by the sound of chains and hydraulic equipment, looking out to see my F-150 being loaded onto a flatbed while Kenneth supervised in his pink dress shirt, clipboard in hand, absolutely convinced he'd just eliminated a problem vehicle. I stepped outside in my flannel shirt and jeans, badge and radio in hand, watching them steal my personal property while Kenneth gloated about his authority to enforce community standards. The tow truck driver, realizing he was stealing a police chief's vehicle, immediately began backing down, but Kenneth insisted the tow was legitimate under HOA authority. "This is a legitimate community standards enforcement action," Kenneth declared, his voice rising as the situation spiraled beyond his control. Commercial vehicles don't get special treatment just because someone wears a badge. Residential neighborhoods have standards that apply to everyone equally. What Kenneth didn't realize was that Texas Occupations Code Chapter 2308 requires specific authorization for private property tows, including property owner consent, posted signage, and immediate police notification. By having my truck towed from my own driveway without my consent, Kenneth had committed theft under state law, not community standards enforcement. The tow truck operator, recognizing the legal liability, released my vehicle immediately and provided documentation showing Kenneth had falsified the tow authorization by claiming my truck was abandoned in a fire lane rather than legally parked in my own driveway. Kenneth's systematic harassment had escalated to criminal theft, providing me with clear evidence of his criminal intent. The war was escalating exactly as Kenneth planned, but he'd made one critical error in his calculations. He thought he was fighting some suburban police family who could be intimidated through regulatory pressure and vehicle theft. What he'd actually done was provide the police chief with evidence of criminal harassment and theft that violated multiple state laws protecting law enforcement families from retaliation. Kenneth's next move would be his last as a free man, because the police chief whose family he'd been systematically harassing was about to demonstrate exactly what happens when someone commits crimes against law enforcement personnel, while abusing the very emergency services designed to protect public safety. The moment Kenneth coordinated that 2:03 a.m. theft of my truck, he crossed the line from harassment into felony criminal territory, and my 26 years of law enforcement experience kicked into full investigative mode that would systematically dismantle his entire criminal enterprise. I spent the following weekend in my home office, surrounded by police reports, complaint logs, and case files, building what prosecutors would later call the most thorough harassment and theft investigation in department history. What Kenneth didn't know was that Chief Daniel Rodriguez had written the department's systematic harassment investigation protocols he was about to face, including developing the approach that made prosecuting criminal targeting of law enforcement families a departmental specialty, resulting in serious criminal convictions and enhanced penalties for crimes against police personnel. My investigation began with Kenneth's theft of my truck, and the evidence was overwhelming. The tow truck operator had provided documentation showing Kenneth falsified the authorization by claiming my vehicle was abandoned in a fire lane when it was legally parked in my own driveway. Under Texas Penal Code Section 31:3, taking someone's vehicle without consent constitutes theft, regardless of claimed HOA authority. But the real treasure was what I discovered when I pulled Kenneth's complete complaint history from our department's database. Over 32 months, Kenneth had filed 73 complaints with various city agencies, including 38 direct calls to police dispatch about normal neighborhood activities that posed no threat to public safety. The pattern was unmistakable: systematic abuse of emergency services designed to harass families while wasting thousands of dollars in police resources. When systematic false reporting involves targeting of law enforcement personnel, it triggers enhanced criminal penalties under Texas Penal Code Section 37:8, which includes mandatory jail time and financial restitution for wasted emergency resources, plus additional charges for interfering with police operations and harassing law enforcement families. My analysis revealed Kenneth had been coordinating with other HOA boards throughout the county, sharing tactics for eliminating police presence through systematic harassment disguised as community governance. Through my professional network with other police chiefs, I learned Kenneth had been consulting with anti-police activists, providing training materials for targeting law enforcement families through bureaucratic intimidation and false reporting. Kenneth wasn't just a local HOA tyrant. He was a regional coordinator in systematic harassment of law enforcement families designed to eliminate police presence from residential communities. The network included individuals with documented hostility toward police personnel and systematic campaigns to make law enforcement families unwelcome in suburban neighborhoods. The conspiracy extended beyond Kenneth to include HOA board members who'd participated in coordinated harassment. Gerald Morrison had filed 24 complaints about police activities, claiming authority to regulate law enforcement in civilian neighborhoods. Sandra Phillips had made 17 harassment reports targeting my family, documenting normal activities while framing them as inappropriate police conduct. Each harassment report constituted criminal behavior under state anti-stalking statutes, and the coordinated nature elevated individual crimes into conspiracy charges, carrying enhanced penalties for systematic targeting of law enforcement personnel and their families. The evidence compilation revealed systematic targeting that extended far beyond my family to include harassment of law enforcement personnel based on their profession and their family's right to live peacefully in residential neighborhoods. Kenneth's operation had generated over 240 false complaints throughout the county, wasting an estimated $67,000 in police resources while harassing families whose only crime was choosing law enforcement careers. The money trail uncovered through my investigation revealed Kenneth's operation was more sophisticated than typical harassment. He'd been coordinating with corrupt towing companies that provided kickbacks for referrals, legal services specializing in harassment litigation, and private investigators who gathered information about targeted families to maximize harassment effectiveness. My law enforcement connections provided access to investigative resources Kenneth never anticipated. The FBI's domestic terrorism unit was immediately interested when I provided evidence of systematic targeting of law enforcement families affecting multiple jurisdictions. The county prosecutor assigned investigators who specialized in crimes against police personnel and had been building cases against anti-police networks. The state attorney general's office opened investigations into systematic harassment of law enforcement families and criminal conspiracy to interfere with police operations through coordinated false reporting that wasted taxpayer resources while targeting police personnel for their profession and public service. Kenneth's harassment of one police chief's family had triggered investigations by multiple agencies, specializing in protecting law enforcement families from criminal targeting and domestic terrorism. The surveillance operation I coordinated through police intelligence revealed Kenneth's activities extended far beyond what I'd witnessed personally. He was conducting systematic research on law enforcement families throughout the region, attempting to identify vulnerable officers whose families could be eliminated through harassment campaigns. Kenneth had escalated from neighborhood complaints to what investigators classified as domestic terrorism, targeting police families through systematic harassment, designed to eliminate law enforcement presence. The most damaging evidence came when investigators uncovered Kenneth's connections to anti-police extremist groups that opposed law enforcement presence in civilian communities and sought to eliminate police families through systematic harassment disguised as community governance and property value protection. The network included individuals with histories of anti-government activities, documented hostility toward law enforcement personnel, and systematic campaigns to eliminate police presence through harassment, intimidation, and criminal interference with law enforcement operations and family safety. Kenneth's operation was funded by organizations that opposed police presence in civilian communities and sought to eliminate law enforcement families through systematic harassment, while corrupting local government to provide legal cover for criminal activities targeting police personnel. The evidence compilation took 6 months and filled 37 bankers' boxes with documents, recordings, complaint logs, and digital evidence. The county grand jury returned indictments against Kenneth and 19 co-conspirators on charges including systematic harassment of law enforcement personnel, theft, conspiracy to interfere with police operations, and abuse of emergency services. Kenneth faced additional charges for criminal theft of my vehicle, systematic filing of false police reports, and criminal conspiracy to eliminate law enforcement presence from residential communities through harassment that violated multiple state laws protecting police families from retaliation and discrimination. My role in the investigation remained confidential until arrests were completed, which meant continuing to endure Kenneth's harassment while investigators gathered additional evidence. But every false complaint he filed, every harassment report he made, Kenneth's desperation reached criminal insanity when he decided to escalate from theft to systematic stalking and intimidation. And the morning he made his most fatal mistake, police units were already positioned throughout Stone Ridge Reserve documenting every crime he committed while targeting a law enforcement family. It was November 18th, a cold Tuesday morning with frost covering the streets, when Kenneth arrived with 2 private security guards and what he claimed was legal authority to conduct compliance inspections of my property for ongoing commercial vehicle violations. The smell of diesel exhaust and his cheap cologne mixed as he stood there in his pink dress shirt and black dress pants, clipboard pressed against his chest like armor. Absolutely convinced, he'd found the authority to intimidate the police chief whose truck he'd already stolen once and whose family he'd been systematically harassing for months. What Kenneth didn't know was that police officers were stationed throughout the neighborhood documenting his harassment pattern. Detective units were recording his conversations, and I was coordinating the investigation that would capture every word of his confession to criminal stalking and intimidation of law enforcement personnel. The compliance inspection authorization Kenneth presented was a masterpiece of criminal fraud, complete with fabricated county signatures, forged legal references, and official-looking documentation that would have convinced most homeowners they were facing legitimate government authority. Kenneth had obviously invested significant money in creating convincing paperwork, designed to intimidate law enforcement families into compliance with his anti-police demands. My 26 years of law enforcement experience had taught me to recognize fraudulent legal documents, and Kenneth's authorization was obviously fake to anyone familiar with actual inspection procedures. The document lacked proper case numbers, contained forged signatures from officials who had no authority over residential property, and cited ordinances that specifically exempted law enforcement personnel from HOA interference. Kenneth had essentially created fraudulent government documents, while simultaneously proving he had no authority to conduct inspections on police officers' private property. The security guards Kenneth had hired were legitimate professionals who'd been deceived about their assignment through his fraudulent documentation. When I calmly identified myself as the police chief whose property was being targeted and displayed my badge and department identification, the security guards immediately backed away from Kenneth's operation and began documenting their own protection from liability. "Chief, if there's any question about authority, we're not participating in harassment of law enforcement personnel," the lead guard said, securing his equipment while Kenneth screamed threats and accusations. "We don't target police families for nobody, especially not with fake paperwork that could land us in federal prison." The recording equipment I was wearing captured Kenneth's increasingly desperate attempts to convince the security team to continue harassing my family despite my identification as police chief, and their recognition that they were being used to commit crimes against law enforcement personnel. "This is legitimate HOA authority that supersedes individual law enforcement positions," Kenneth screamed, his voice rising with panic as his harassment scheme collapsed. "Police equipment and activities don't get special treatment in residential neighborhoods, where community standards and property values matter more than law enforcement convenience." Every word was being recorded by investigators who would later testify that Kenneth had confessed to systematic targeting of law enforcement families, while demonstrating criminal intent to eliminate police presence from residential communities through harassment and intimidation. Kenneth's backup plan revealed the true scope of his anti-police obsession when he began attempting to physically damage my truck by placing what he called violation stickers on police equipment and attempting to disable the vehicle through tampering with tires and battery connections. The criminal activity escalated when Kenneth began trying to break into my truck to remove what he claimed were inappropriate commercial modifications that violated residential standards. His systematic attempt to tamper with police equipment, while officers watched from surveillance positions, transformed his harassment campaign into felony criminal behavior. The psychological warfare reached its peak when Kenneth began making threats that revealed his systematic plan to eliminate all law enforcement families from residential neighborhoods through criminal harassment and property destruction. "You think your police chief position will protect you from community authority," he said, pointing aggressively while his pink dress shirt stretched across his gut, sweat visible despite the cold weather. "But residential neighborhoods belong to civilian families who deserve protection from law enforcement activities and police presence that threatens property values." Kenneth had just confessed to systematic anti-police bias while attempting to commit crimes against law enforcement property, creating evidence of hate crimes targeting police personnel and criminal conspiracy to interfere with police operations through harassment of law enforcement families. The recording equipment captured Kenneth's detailed anti-police statements, his systematic plan to eliminate law enforcement families from civilian communities, and his belief that civilian authority superseded police officers' right to live peacefully in residential neighborhoods. The climax came when Kenneth attempted to have his security guards physically remove me from my own property while he completed destruction of my police equipment, transforming his harassment campaign into assault on a police officer and criminal trespass with intent to commit property damage. The police officers who'd been monitoring Kenneth's harassment campaign moved in when he committed multiple felonies in their presence, including attempted destruction of police property, assault on a police officer, and criminal conspiracy to interfere with law enforcement operations. Detective Sarah Martinez approached Kenneth with her credentials displayed, her voice calm and professional as she explained that he was under police surveillance for systematic harassment of law enforcement families and was now being arrested for crimes committed in the presence of police officers. The color drained from Kenneth's face as he realized his theatrical harassment campaign had been a police sting operation designed to catch him committing felonies, while investigators built cases that would send him to county jail for systematic targeting of law enforcement personnel. Kenneth's arrest was captured on police body cameras, as officers documented every aspect of his criminal operation. His pink dress shirt was soaked with sweat as Detective Martinez read him his rights, while other officers photographed his fraudulent inspection authorization, secured his clipboard containing detailed anti-police harassment plans, and arrested his security guards for participating in attempted crimes against law enforcement property. The police investigation expanded dramatically when officers discovered Kenneth's coordination with anti-police extremist networks throughout multiple states, revealing that his harassment of my family was part of a systematic criminal enterprise specializing in eliminating law enforcement presence from residential communities. Kenneth hadn't just been harassing one police chief's family. He'd been running a criminal organization that specialized in systematic targeting of law enforcement personnel across multiple jurisdictions for the purpose of eliminating police presence from civilian neighborhoods through criminal harassment, disguised as community standards enforcement. The evidence trail revealed Kenneth's operation had targeted over 40 law enforcement families throughout the region, wasted an estimated $89,000 in police resources, and systematically harassed police personnel whose only crime was choosing to serve their communities while living in residential neighborhoods. The county grand jury returned a superseding indictment with 84 criminal charges, including systematic harassment of law enforcement personnel, attempted destruction of police property, criminal conspiracy to interfere with police operations, and domestic terrorism designed to eliminate police presence from residential communities. Kenneth's world was collapsing faster than his fake HOA authority, and he had no idea that his next court appearance would involve facing enhanced penalties for crimes against law enforcement personnel. While the police chief, whose family he'd systematically harassed, testified about the full scope of his anti-police criminal enterprise. The county courthouse had never seen anything quite like People v. Kenneth Sutherland and Associates, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone that Kenneth would be facing sentencing for systematic targeting of law enforcement families, while the police chief whose truck he'd stolen sat in the gallery wearing his dress uniform. Representing both the victim and the law enforcement community, Kenneth had systematically attacked through his criminal enterprise. The courtroom was packed with police officers, law enforcement families, community members, and public safety advocates who'd come to witness what prosecutors called the most comprehensive anti-police harassment prosecution in county history. Kenneth sat at the defendant's table in his orange county jail jumpsuit, his pink dress shirt and black dress pants replaced by detention clothing, looking like a deflated balloon as he faced the consequences of targeting the wrong police chief's family with his systematic campaign of criminal harassment and theft of law enforcement property. I'd maintained my role as police chief throughout the investigation, but county sentencing guidelines required my testimony about the scope of his criminal activities and their impact on law enforcement families and police operations. Judge Patricia Williams, a former prosecutor who understood the serious nature of systematic targeting of law enforcement personnel, would be handling Kenneth's sentencing with the judicial precision that makes county sentences educational experiences for criminals who target police families. The smell of furniture polish and legal authority filled the courtroom as Kenneth's attorney, an overworked public defender named James Thompson, prepared to argue for Mercy in a case where Mercy would insult every law enforcement family Kenneth had victimized. The evidence presentation took 8 days and filled the court record with overwhelming documentation of Kenneth's systematic anti-police criminal enterprise. County prosecutors presented 647 pieces of evidence, including recorded conversations of Kenneth attempting to steal my truck, documentation of his coordinated harassment scheme targeting law enforcement families, financial records showing $89,000 in wasted police resources, and testimony from 43 law enforcement families who'd been targeted by Kenneth's criminal harassment campaigns. The scope of his criminal organization was staggering, involving anti-police extremist groups in multiple states, coordination with criminal networks that specialized in targeting law enforcement personnel, and a sophisticated operation designed specifically to eliminate police presence from residential communities through systematic harassment, intimidation, and theft of police property. My victim impact testimony provided the court with detailed analysis of Kenneth's criminal methods and their broader implications for law enforcement, family safety, and police-community relations. Your Honor, I began, addressing Judge Williams while Kenneth squirmed in his seat. The defendant didn't just steal my personal truck from my own driveway. He systematically undermined public safety by targeting law enforcement families with criminal harassment designed to eliminate police presence from residential communities where families depend on law enforcement protection. His actions represent domestic terrorism, specifically targeting law enforcement personnel, and his criminal organization poses ongoing threats to police family safety and community policing effectiveness throughout our region. Every harassment campaign he conducted meant police officers were dealing with systematic targeting instead of protecting citizens from actual criminals, and his anti-police activities threatened the foundation of police-community relations that make neighborhoods safe. The financial destruction was swift and comprehensive, as county asset forfeiture proceedings seized every asset Kenneth had acquired through his harassment schemes. His Stone Ridge Reserve mansion, valued at $1.4 million, was forfeited to compensate victims of his anti-police harassment campaigns and reimburse law enforcement agencies for resources wasted investigating his fraudulent complaints. His luxury vehicles, investment accounts, and HOA board positions were eliminated as part of his criminal conviction. Kenneth's entire lifestyle, built on harassing police families and interfering with law enforcement operations, was dismantled by law enforcement professionals who specialized in protecting police personnel from criminal targeting. Kenneth's co-conspirators faced their own justice as the criminal organization collapsed under prosecution. Gerald Morrison received 26 months in county jail for conspiracy and systematic harassment of law enforcement families, his HOA board position forfeited, and his reputation destroyed. Sandra Phillips, who'd participated in coordinated targeting of police families, received 22 months for criminal harassment that wasted thousands in police resources. The anti-police extremist networks that had funded Kenneth's harassment campaigns faced federal investigation and civil liability, resulting in millions in damages to affected law enforcement families, while exposing their systematic targeting of police personnel for criminal harassment. Judge Williams's sentencing remarks became legendary in county court circles for their comprehensive protection of law enforcement families and condemnation of anti-police criminal enterprises. "Mr. Sutherland," she said, looking directly at Kenneth as he sat trembling in his orange jumpsuit, "you have systematically victimized law enforcement families through a criminal organization that specialized in anti-police harassment disguised as community governance. Your targeting of police personnel represents an attack on public safety that threatens the foundation of law enforcement effectiveness and the trust between police officers and the communities they serve. This court will not tolerate such egregious criminal conduct that endangers law enforcement families while interfering with police operations that protect public safety." The sentence was devastating and final: 31 months in county jail without early release, followed by 8 years of supervised probation with restrictions on HOA activities, contact with law enforcement families, and residence in communities where police officers live. Kenneth would be 65 years old before his probation ended, and county supervision would prevent him from ever again living near law enforcement families. The civil judgment was equally comprehensive as county court awarded $347,000 in damages for systematic harassment of law enforcement families, theft of police property, and criminal interference with law enforcement operations. The judgment included restitution to every law enforcement family Kenneth had harassed and full reimbursement to police agencies for resources wasted investigating his fraudulent complaints. The legislative impact of Kenneth's case extended far beyond individual justice, as the County Council passed the Law Enforcement Family Protection Act, strengthening penalties for systematic harassment of police personnel and creating enhanced protections for law enforcement families whose service makes them targets for anti-police extremists. My truck remains parked in my driveway where it belongs, serving as both a symbol of law enforcement presence and a deterrent to criminal activity in Stone Ridge Reserve. The neighborhood has become one of the safest communities in the county, with crime rates dropping dramatically after Kenneth's arrest demonstrated the consequences of targeting law enforcement families. The annual Law Enforcement Appreciation Day celebration at our neighborhood park draws hundreds of families who support police officers and understand the sacrifices made by law enforcement personnel. Kenneth's story became a cautionary tale taught in police academy training programs, about protecting law enforcement families from criminal harassment. His systematic harassment of one police chief's family triggered the largest anti-police harassment investigation in county history, destroyed a criminal organization operating across multiple states, and resulted in legislation protecting law enforcement families while ensuring police officers can live peacefully in the communities they serve. The neighborhood still echoes with sounds of children playing safely, families gathering for community events, and the quiet confidence that